everybody, so why does Hollywood behave the way it does, with endless reboots and sequels, fan blaming, prioritizing messaging over entertainment, all the regular stuff that it's been doing? It's been doing this for 10 years at this point, and it is showing no sign of deviating, pivoting, or even reconsidering its strategy. Well, what the interesting thing is that you can actually explain a lot of this from a business perspective when you understand the incentives that Hollywood has created for itself by virtue of the situation they've got themselves into. And that's what we're going to cover on this video. This is a business analysis of Hollywood's incentive structure. Let's dive in. Okay, so here's the deal. I have compiled this, and I'd like to take you through it. Please forgive some of the crudity of these slides and reference materials I have here, but hopefully you can see this. Okay, so explaining Hollywood's behavior. Well, basically there's two pillars to this, two big things that make this happen. On one side, you've got what I'm calling creative accounting. Financial engineering is a little bit strong of a term, but it's almost into that territory that you could argue that Hollywood has done for itself here. What this does, this gives them a runway. That means that they are not feeling the financial consequences of what they're doing, and they still have more runway left. It's going to be at least another 2 years, probably 5 years, before there really is a reckoning financially for the lack of hits that this current approach has generated. That's on one side. You've got the accounting. On the other side, you've got something I'm going to call a balanced scorecard. That is the incentive structure. Okay, so when you look at the decision makers inside Hollywood and you look at what actually drives their decisions, what incentives are in place for them to make certain decisions, it's because obviously the financial performance of the films and TV that they're greenlighting and producing is not the number one consideration. There are other things that are driving them to behave the way they do, and we're going to talk about some of those other factors. What this does, this gives you the effect of there's no deviation from their current ideology. And when I say ideology for the purposes of this video, it's defined as the incentives that are non-monetary that push them in a certain direction, okay? This is going to involve things like talking about the careers of the executives themselves and the major principal agent problem that they have within Hollywood. So let's dive in. Okay, so just so it's clear who we're talking about here, I wanted to break down what the studios are. Now, you may be familiar with this. These are the studios in the United States, in Hollywood. So, okay, first of all, number one, you have Disney/ABC, okay? And a lot of these companies, they are called conglomerates, right? Conglomerates. They're technically not a conglomerate. A conglomerate is a collection of totally unrelated businesses, like owning a plumbing business and a diamond mine and an insurance company. You know, like they're totally unconnected, right? That's technically a conglomerate. What these studios are is they're actually vertically integrated businesses. So they have multiple business units, but the business units are related in some ways. So, for example, whoops, I managed to delete something here. Here we go. So Disney, ABC, they also own other cable networks, right? They own, I think they have the broadband business where they're making money on providing broadband internet. They have theme parks. They have many products like merchandising, and stuff. They have traditional physical medium like DVDs, Blu-ray, all that kind of stuff. So they're doing a lot of things. They got multiple business units doing a lot of things. Of course, they own the ABC TV network in the States and the Disney company. So that's the first one. Warner HBO is the second one. And just like Disney, they own a lot of this other stuff. Okay, so Warner is the movie studio. HBO is their TV, like streaming service. Universal, NBC. So Universal is the traditional film company, film studio. NBC is the national cable network they have. And once again, they own their version of this other portfolio of other businesses. Paramount / CBS. Paramount was the movie studio, and CBS was their national network, TV network. And once again, they have their own version of this. I don't think they have parks, but they have the rest of it. Number 5, I don't know why that says song. That's supposed to say Sony. Number 5 is Sony. Now, Sony is less of a diversified company. Okay, they don't own a lot of this stuff here, but they own the electronics business, Sony Electronics, and they produce things like PlayStation. So, some sizable other units there too, okay? And then you have others that, there's a lot of other players, but these are the big 5. Number 6, by the way, is Amazon. Amazon purchased MGM as their film studio, and so they've set up their own studios. So they're number 6, but primarily we're talking about these 5. Most of what I say does apply to Amazon also. So that's who we're talking about. So maybe you realized or you didn't realize that that Hollywood was essentially concentrated into these 5 studios. Okay, so we were talking about here the first part of this, the creative accounting. So let's talk about that. Now, here's some interesting accounting notes of how they've structured their business. If you are an accountant, you may appreciate this. You'll probably understand some of the accounting terms a lot better than I do, but if you're a finance person, you should be able to appreciate this. If you're a business person, you should be able to appreciate this. It's actually a very interesting setup. Here we go. Okay, so what gives these studios a runway? Why is it that they can make very bad decisions, creative decisions, leading to films and TV that do not make money in most cases? They're producing a record number of flops, and these are not producing cash. Okay, they're losing money more often than not on the content they make. And this has been going on for 10 years. What allows them to do this? What gives them the ability to not feel the financial consequences of that? Well, there's 4 big things here. Number 1 is legacy IP. So using Disney as the most prominent example, is they own a huge library of intellectual property, all their old films, all their old TV shows, things they've acquired, right? Okay. And for the most part, those produce cash. Okay. So they have been paid off. The costs have been paid and covered in the past for the most part, and they go on generating cash. So a lot of the franchises and a lot of the sort of entertainment that, perhaps most people grew up with, that, you associate with Disney, that's what I'm talking about. So those are producing cash, okay? And like we're going to talk about in greater detail later, Disney is a vertically integrated company. They got multiple business units, so they're pooling their cash. So a film studio might lose money, but the legacy IP is generating money, so you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, like this kind of idea, right? Another thing that's keeping them from feeling any financial consequences is this. They're borrowing from lenders. They're borrowing money, okay? So they're taking on a lot of new debt. And we can see this by looking at the balance sheets for some of these studios, okay? Now, for 15 years, you had very low interest rates so that the cost of debt was very minimal. So that further encouraged the studios to borrow a lot, and they did. And so what they're having to do is they're having to make the interest payments on that debt. Okay, so they're servicing the debt. And what we're seeing now in the last year or so is that taking on new debt is starting to dry up. It's starting to shrink from what they traditionally have done. It's getting more expensive. And there might be other factors too, but this traditionally has been what's sustaining them. They're borrowing money and using it to make films. Okay? Now, here's a quirk of how this works. Okay? You might think of traditionally how movies would be made on the small scale. Think of a lot of famous directors when they were just starting out. They would have to go cap in hand to financiers and say, would you invest in my movie as an equity partner? And or as a debt partner, you lend me money, I make a movie with it, and then I pay you back. And then we make a profit, right? So in that case, the financier, the lender, is asking questions like, what is this movie? Who's it for? Who's going to be directing it? Who's going to be acting in it? Who's the big star? How are you going to make back the money? So they would ask questions like this. These are probably good questions, right? They stress test the idea in the first place to see if it's likely to actually be a success. Okay? But what we're seeing at this level in Hollywood is the following. Okay? When we're talking about something the size of Disney borrowing money from institutional lenders, okay, the lenders are not questioning the creative decisions that Disney is making. It doesn't enter into the discussion of whether the lender is going to lend money to Disney. Instead, it's almost like you're going to get a mortgage, you're going to buy a house. What they care about is does the firm as a whole, like Disney, is it able to cover its interest payments? Is there a steady flow of cash that shows that it's good for taking on more debt? Okay, they look at debt ratios and things like this, right? And then they look at things like collateral, right? Usually when you get a mortgage or something, you use the house as collateral so that if you don't pay back your debt, the lender can take your house, right? That idea. So as we'll discuss later on, that's actually something that Disney is doing. It's counting the movie as, collateral. So the lenders lend against the firm as a whole. So Disney as a whole, they look at Disney's credit rating, and whatever movie Disney wants to make, they need cash for, the lender lends it to them. Okay? They look at the cash flow history. They don't look at the individual films or content that Disney is proposing to make with this cash. Okay? So those decisions are not being questioned by a third party. What is the interesting fact here is that if Disney were to make content that was bad, that the audience, say, rejects and it's flop and it's not popular, that erosion of Disney's goodwill is not obvious when you look at cash flows, right? And we're going to get into how those cash flows are sustained in a moment. Okay, number 3, this is a big one here. The conglomerate structure. Okay, so Disney is not just a film studio. It's a theme park. It's a merchandising business. It's sales of, physical media. And it's by far a collection of IP, old IP, beloved Disney brands and movies that we've all heard of that continue to make money to this day, right? Now, Disney bundles all of that together. It's what they call a conglomerate in this vernacular. It's actually a vertically integrated corporation. So what they're doing is you have cash pooling, where the divisions of the company that are making money put that money into a pool, and it's covering the losses of the divisions of the company that are not making money. They're actually losing money. Okay, so they're cross-subsidizing one business unit to another. Okay, they're cash sharing among business units. So this is the key. Disney as a whole might be profitable, but the film studio might be losing money hand over fist. Okay, a lot of that money that they're making is coming from borrowing. It's coming from legacy IP. Right. Now, the other thing that's also contributing to giving those companies a runway, those studios, is streaming. Streaming has come onto the scene relatively recently. It's become a big thing, okay? And regardless of how it's doing as a business concern, it's led to some interesting effects, okay? And in particular, you get opacity, where it's very vague if something is a success, is something a flop, right? You see, when you put things on streaming, you're selling the streaming package as a whole. So people either get your entire service or they get none of it, right? It's not like going to the movie theater where you buy tickets for an individual film or an individual piece of content, right? It's just all bundled together, right? So what's happening is that a lot of the engagement metrics, like a lot of metrics they use to gauge the effectiveness of their streaming service, it's relying on bundling, where you're bundling like all the content together. And also there's issues with not publicizing that stuff outside of the organization. So it's very hard to see if something is a flop or a hit, right? Okay. It makes it easier internally for executives to no longer be pinned to per show profitability. Okay. And this is something that, we're going to come back to. Of course, they have all the internal metrics for this. It's just that the public perception of it and perception among partners is really starting to be obfuscated. Okay? So this is helping to preserve this idea that they are indeed just as successful now with their modern stuff as they were in the past. You can easily hide that information from the outside world. And that serves their purposes because a lot of their value depends on their legacy IP having value. Okay? And what they would love to do is they'd love to convince the world that the content they've been putting out in the last 10 years is just as valuable and just as successful as all the old stuff. And this is the vehicle in which, they're doing this. It's also important from an accounting standpoint. It's very hard to write down the value of modern content and also legacy franchises that have been bolstered by modern content. It's very easy to keep that valued as high if you're obfuscating the performance of the new stuff. That's the idea. Okay, so all of this serves to give these studios a runway. Okay, so what that means is they can borrow as much money as they want. They can cross-subsidize, their loss leaders, like their film studios, with stronger businesses, like their legacy IP and licensing. And that means they can keep getting debt, and therefore they're not going to be feeling the effects financially of some of the flops they produced in the last 10 years, so they can keep doing what they're doing. The consequences haven't caught up with them yet, and they have approximately 5 years left of it, as close as I can figure. I could be wrong about that, but that's my estimate. Okay, so that's one half of this. Now, and here's some background data. So we talked about conglomerate. It's a cross-subsidy, cash pooling. This would be illegal in funds with external limited partners, by the way. You can't rob one account to make another account look profitable. There's clear rules. But in this type of business, it's business as usual. It's perfectly above board. It's perfectly legal. Okay, so now here's another major piece to the puzzle. I've seen a lot of people do videos online analyzing whether a movie that these studios have released is making money or losing money. Okay? And the assumption under that is that if they, say, take $200 million and make a movie, and then they release the movie to the box office, and then the box office returns are not enough to cover the cost of the movie and like the total cost of the movie, then the assumption is that they've lost money on it, right? Well, that's not actually how the accounting works in Hollywood land because of the special structure they've set up. And this is how they're doing it. Okay, so as I delete everything here we go. Okay, so here's what they're actually doing. Instead of expensing the movies and TV shows that they make, okay, and saying that was a cost that we incurred, instead what they're doing is they're capitalizing it. What that means is it's almost like buying a house, where if you take a chunk of money out of your bank account and then use it to buy a house, what you're doing is you're saying, I haven't actually lost any money. All I've done is I've converted the wealth that I have from cash to real estate, right? So instead of having, let's say I bought a house for, I don't know, $1 million, whatever. The house cost me $1 million. I took $1 million out of my bank account. Pretty nice if you can do it. And I bought a $1 million house, right? So when you look at my financial statements, I show a outgoing cash flow of $1 million from my bank account, but I show that I've now acquired a house worth $1 million. So on my balance sheet, there's no net gain or loss. I've just converted my wealth to another form. Okay? So that's what Hollywood's doing. That's how they count it. They don't expense the movie. They capitalize it. So what this shows is it shows as a capital asset, not an expense. So instead of showing a house on your balance sheet, you show a movie. And the reason they can do this is because the movie is still expected to generate future benefit. You could sell toys based on that movie. You could do sales of physical medium. You could license the movie to other TV networks and they could show it, et cetera, et cetera. You could put it back in the movie theaters and generate even more ticket sales, right? So in theory, you could make more money off that movie. It's not just the initial box office run, right? So for that reason, they count it on the books as an asset. They own a movie that's worth $200 million. And in the future, presumably, they're going to turn more of that movie's value back into cash, right? Now, who's to argue that? Any sane person would say, well, look, the audience hated it, all the critics hated it, and there's a huge backlash. It's spawned. The sales of your toys for that franchise have gone down by 90%. But, that's just a clever argument, right? So for these people, technically, it could still generate future benefit, right? So it's on the books as an asset worth $200 million, okay? This requires, the way it would work is that if you then turned around and said that, it turns out that movie, I don't think we're going to be able to make any more money off it. The fact that we own this flop, I don't think we're going to turn that into cash and we're going to see any of that money. So you would write down the value of that asset on your balance sheet. That's what accountants would do. They would all get together and they'd connive a plan and they would go into a huddle and then they'd decide this, okay? So this requires write-downs or impairments, and it's entirely at the management discretion how much that movie is worth on the books. This is the key part, okay? If lenders force them to reevaluate this asset being really worth $2 million, okay, they would have to amortize it upon the negative optics, right? You like that lingo? So if it looks like it's not a flop, you could maybe get the company to write down the value of it, but that's entirely at the management's discretion. That's the key. So instead of something that called mark-to-market accounting, which was like something that appeared in scandals like the Enron scandal way back in the day, this is something even worse. It's almost like mark-to-assumption accounting. You just assume that it's worth this much amount of money and that you're going to make it back somehow, someday. So it is. You like that? Okay, now lenders who lend money to Disney and these studios are okay as long as the cash is coming in to cover their interest payments. And that cash, as we've talked about previously, is mainly coming from different business units. For example, selling all the legacy IP, the old IP, okay? Or theme parks, etc., right? Okay? So as long as the cash is coming in to cover interest payments, they won't force the studios like Disney to do any write-downs. So that movie still shows as an asset worth $200 million, even though it completely flopped at the box office and everybody hates it. You see, the value, the IP value, like the movie being capitalized, that props up everything, right? That's how this works from an accounting sense. Okay? So that's a big factor here, okay? And the other thing that's allowing them to do this, okay, is debt rollover. So they borrowed money in the past. That debt is now due. You got to pay the piper. What they're doing is they're repackaging it. They're paying off the original lender, and then they're borrowing even more from a second lender. Okay, so they're just rolling that debt forward. They're not actually paying it off. They're just paying off the interest as they go. Okay, and the way they can do this, the way that a lender would agree to doing this with Disney, is because on the books it shows that Disney and all the other studios, they own assets like that flop movie, but on the books it's a $200 million asset. Oh, I'm about to sneeze. As one does when they find out about this kind of thing. Right? Okay, so that's kind of some of what I would call creative accounting. It's not really creative accounting. It's perfectly legal from an accounting standpoint. It's just when you look at the cumulative effect of all these things and how they interplay, it's leading to some very interesting effects. It means that they can keep borrowing money to fuel this, and it's not going to end anytime soon. Okay, so let's keep going here. Now, here, if we go back to our original thing here, we've talked about this, the creative accounting, okay? That leads to a runway that gives them time, right? So they're insulated for the moment from the financial consequences. Some studios more than others, the more diversified they are, the more they're insulated. Now let's talk about this, the balanced scorecard, okay? Here's where we're talking about the decision makers in the company. We're talking about things other than accounting, and we're talking about careers, incentives, and ideology, meaning the priorities that they focus on other than making money. Okay, let's talk about that. So, let's talk about this. Executive careers. Okay, so when I say executives, I mean executive managers at the studios, the ones that are responsible for green lighting projects. Okay? Now, those of you familiar with business, you'll know what this is, a principal-agent problem. That is where, technically, these employees are agents of the company. That means that they're not supposed to be looking out for their own interests. They're supposed to be looking out for the company's interests. So when they give someone a job as an executive manager, put them in charge, that person is not supposed to be working on how to enrich themselves. They're supposed to be working on how to enrich the company, right? They're supposed to be an agent of the company. And if instead of doing that, they're only looking to further themselves at the expense of the company, that's called a principal agent problem. We have a major principal agent problem in these studios. Let's dive in. Okay, so the executives that greenlight content are furthering their careers to the detriment of the firm's interests. We can see that by them deliberately choosing to make content that deals with unpopular elements, things that the audience has said that we're not interested in, we're hostile to, and we don't want to consume that content. And we're not going to pay for that content if you produce it. But yet, despite that, the executives decide to greenlight that type of content anyway. So obviously, profit is not their sole factor that's defining their incentives. Okay? This is caused by priorities other than financial success. Now, what I'm calling ideology, because I need a label for that thing, the other priorities, and it's not simply one other thing that they care about, it's several other things they care about other than making money. Okay? So I'm calling that ideology. Now, one example of this ideology was introduced by ESG initiatives, okay? So environmental, social, governance initiatives, which is a trendy thing, okay? It's not the worst thing in the world, but it can be misapplied or abused, as in this case. Now, generally speaking, for our discussions, the E and the G are not a problem. So environmental and governance are not a problem. Environmental is like, not dumping oil into rivers, and governance is like, let's make sure that we have anti-corruption policies in place. Those are not really the problem. But the S, the social, there's some interesting things going on in there. One of these is DEI, okay? So diversity, equity, and inclusion, okay? Now, a point I want to make is that there was some confusion a couple of months ago, or maybe a bit more than that, about the CEO of BlackRock making some statements about, their ESG priorities when they do what they do, which is be equity partners and invest in a lot of other companies. BlackRock invests in companies that are like, they're on indexes, popular companies. That's why they're involved with Disney, for example. Okay. But this is not coming from BlackRock. This is an internal thing that's specified by Disney. Okay. It really feels like the BlackRock thing was almost like a false trail. It doesn't really lead to the culprit here, at least as far as I've been able to determine. So things like DEI, okay? Now, by the way, the new term for DEI, companies are going away from using the term DEI because it's got such a bad rap. So they're calling it human capital. That's the new term for it that we're seeing here. So it's the same stuff, just different name, okay? Basically, it's to the topic of who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, who gets demoted, who gets more money, who doesn't, right? Who gets more influence, who doesn't. That's what things like DEI loosely speak to. That's kind of what the purpose is, okay? Okay, so that and other initiatives within this ESG are causing a dilution of the priorities. So now executives are not making decisions purely based on profitability of the project. They're making decisions based on what ESG related goals they are prioritizing. Okay? Normally this is okay. But in this situation, there's some extra little quirks that are going on. Okay? I'm just going to go through this in order. So they're prioritizing ideology in order to further their own career. So in order to further your own career, to not get fired, to make more money, to be given more projects, executives are very tuned in to what will enable that, as anyone is in their lives. You care about yourself, you care about keeping your job, you care about perhaps being promoted in your job if possible, right? So within these organizations, there is a distortion of the incentives where some of the ESG priorities are now more important than the profitability motive. And what's interesting is that when you have a certain critical mass of people, when most people in this ecosystem, in this environment, have been promoted or hired through DEI and other ESG initiatives, it's very hard for them to say DEI and ESG initiatives are bad, because that delegitimizes the fact that you're there, and it also delegitimizes your entire history of decisions you've made at the organization. Okay, so that's definitely a force. So it's very hard to pivot away from this. Okay? Right. Now, the other interesting thing is that there's all kinds of knockoff effects. The audience pushback to projects that they've greenlit, what this can do is it just confirms that their ideology is necessary, because that's how it's viewed. It's viewed as, oh, we think this is good, therefore we made a decision to create that content. That content has not been accepted by the audience, and so we interpret that as, we need to make more of this content because there's definitely a need, right? That's the only way they can really interpret it, because they can't question the validity of the extra incentives, okay, the additional non-financial incentives. Okay, so this is why they can't alter the course. The audience cannot know better, okay? If you turned around and said that, okay, well, we need to prioritize making money, ESG initiatives are not important, that delegitimizes everybody's position and every decision they've made at the organization. They can't roll back the ideology without a total purge. This is the problem, because they've reached critical mass where almost everybody there, or at least more than 50%, is invested in this in some way. I don't know the details. I'm not on the inside of it, but that's what all the indicators are. Okay? And what this means is that this system is locked into place. It is not self-correcting. It will correct to keep this incentive structure until it hits the wall. And the only way to stop it, in my opinion, is a total purge, because the board also is a driving force behind this. So just as executives can't deprioritize some of the non-financial incentives, the board behaves the same. And so the board is obviously determining who the CEO is and certain other critical things. So it's all in lockstep. It's all locked together. Normally, this doesn't automatically come with ESG, that's for sure. It's just that you've got a combination of three things. Number one, you've got the critical mass of executives who are in their current roles because of these other priorities. You've then got this uncorrecting decision structure, okay? And you then are fortunate enough to be in a position when you are insulated against the financial consequences. So it's an interesting, perfect storm that creates this very quirky kind of situation where you're locked into doing a very destructive thing despite all the warning signs. Okay, so what does this result in when you put all this together? Okay, so the ideology, which is ESG goals on the scorecard, remember, this is my term for ideology here. I'm using that to mean a very specific thing, which is the non-monetary incentives of the film studios. That's all I mean by the term ideology here, okay? It leads to incentive asymmetry. What you've got is, if you have to green light something, for example, you can either green light it because of financial performance, or you can green light it because of non-financial incentives like ESG goals. And the ESG goals are immediate, whereas the financial performance is simply a projection, and the reality could work out or not work out depending on if it's a hit or not, right? And history has shown that the financial incentives for a lot of the stuff in the last 10 years are not meeting projections, right? So that tends to make people gravitate towards making the decisions based on the ideology and not the financial performance. It also weakens market feedback, okay? If you don't care about the performance financially of the content, you don't really care about listening to the customers, because whether the customers go or stay, it doesn't really matter to you, okay? The problem is that you need the perception of the performance to be good so that you can not take write-downs on your intellectual property of your IP. That's the weird situation. Okay? It also leads to lock-in when you have a principal agent problem and you're insulated from the financial consequences. This locks in to always follow this and not self-correct because you don't care about the financial performance. So you've got lock-in. What does that result in? It results in audience blaming. You can't have made a mistake, right? Therefore, if it was a flop, then there must be a problem with the audience. You can't admit, we made a mistake, because then lenders would naturally demand a reevaluation of your IP. If you've said it's a hit, what allows you to keep the book value of it is the fact that it's a hit. If you openly admit it's a flop, how can you justify keeping that film on the books for, say, $200 million if you've admitted publicly it's a flop and nobody likes it, right? So you have to deny so that you're allowed to keep this situation, okay? You can't admit the failure of projects publicly since it would force write-downs, that's impairments of IP assets. Now, the other complaint, the final thing I'm going to cover today, is why does Hollywood keep making reboots and sequels and things associated with old IP? Why don't they create original content? Maybe seed some new franchises instead of always trying to add to old ones, right? That's another behavior we've seen. Here's why. Okay, so let's say you wanted to create a new and original movie or TV show. Okay? So you're going to create new IP, new movies and TV with original ideas. Okay? Now, right off the hop, that movie that you're creating has no value as collateral. Okay? If you're trying to pitch this, right? Because no one's heard of it. How can you say it's worth, millions of dollars when nobody knows what it is, right? The audience doesn't know what it is, right? Therefore, reboots and sequels minimize risk, okay? Because you can say, this has value. It has value as collateral, and we can capitalize it. And not just does it have value in itself, but it takes this older franchise that we're also saying is still worth something, and it boosts it too. So if we make a $200 million movie that's like a sequel to some classic IP, we can put on the books that we now have a $200 million asset that we can use as collateral to taking on more debt. And also, this film, by virtue of the fact that it's a sequel to this popular franchise, we can also not take write-downs on the value of the franchise. That can stay high so that it has value as collateral too. So it's like, by making this movie, it's actually affecting two things, right? And this allows us to then be able to go and take on more debt because we've got a lot of collateral. Okay? So reboot sequels are pushed by both executives and finance to bolster value of old IP, extend it, and avoid write-downs, in addition to its own value of this particular movie or TV show, right? So that's why the adding of sequels and reboots to old IP franchises is a twofer, whereas creating new IP is not only not a twofer, it doesn't affect the value of old IP at all in a good way, but it's also risky. So it's like two disadvantages in one. So hopefully that makes sense. We've covered these two pillars, okay, of the incentive structure of Hollywood. We've talked about how this is a perfect storm. 3 critical factors are enabling them to do this. Number one is they've insulated themselves against financial consequences by giving themselves a runway caused by creative accounting. That runway hasn't run out yet. They've still got 2 to 5 years on that in general, by my estimation. We'll see if that turns out to be true. But on the other side, you've got a distortion of incentives for executives that drive a lot of the projects at these studios. Okay, and that's because they're not being evaluated purely on the financial performance of these projects like they have been in the past. Instead, they're also being evaluated on non-financial incentives or criteria, things that a lot of them derive from the general big umbrella of ESG type initiatives, okay? So that's allowing them to gain points by greenlighting something that might not pay off financially, but it scores high on these other initiatives. And the third of 3 elements to the secret sauce is that you now have an environment where a critical mass has been reached, where there's enough people that have been promoted or hired outright through the ESG initiatives. So they can't turn around and say ESG is something we should do away with because if you see what I'm saying, it delegitimizes their job and their entire history of decisions at the company. So it's a perfect storm. And so what this is going to do is it's going to go head on. It's not going to self-correct. It's going to go head on until it hits the wall. The financial consequences catch up. There's no more cash available. And then you have to either gut the whole thing, it's insolvent, or you have to have a complete purge of all these people. And it goes up to board level too. So that's the idea. Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you for listening this long. If you're still here, let me know your thoughts on this in the comments. And I know a lot of people talk about this. I don't normally talk about this, but I am interested in the business side for sure. It's a very interesting case study. And it's a head scratcher for a lot of people watching this happen over the last 10 years. Thanks very much. You guys are awesome. Take care, and I'll see you on the next video.